Okay, that was quite the introduction. So I feel like I've got quite a lot to live up to now. So thanks for that, Matt. So my talk is not probably going to be your standard. This is the research I've done. Please provide comments on it as kind of Matt referred to. I have a very, I lead a double life. So 50% of my time, as Matt mentioned, I'm a researcher. I conduct research myself. I have a European Research Council starting grant at the moment, looking at childcare and childcare diffusion. I'll mention a little bit about this later. So that kind of occupies quite a lot of my time. And as a hobby, I kind of, on the side, 50% of the other time, I do a lot of research infrastructure work. I'm going to get to what that actually means in reality in a moment. But the basic idea, as Matt was referring to, I'm really interested in, as a subject of research, social scientists themselves and why we end up asking the questions that we do ask, and how this is pretty much determined in many instances by the research infrastructure we have to hand. So we're so often guided by the data that we have available, by the expertise we have access to, and so many of these different elements. So what I'm going to do in this talk is discuss how I've kind of approached this question in the Netherlands of what the social scientists actually looking to answer, the questions they're trying to answer, and how can we better facilitate that. So it's not really a standard research presentation. And at the end, there'll be lots of research projects that we see as kind of a sign of first round of success from these projects and an impact that the research infrastructure is having on the research agenda in the Netherlands. Before I actually kind of get into that, though, a little bit, there's a term in there that is not always that commonly used, and particularly on this side of the Atlantic, which is research infrastructure. Now, this is a term that's very common in the European funding body world, and it refers to everything you need to do science, basically. So all the data, the tools, the expertise, everything. And in terms of illustrating what we actually mean here, I wanted to kind of use an historical example because it's really about understanding what drives scientific progress and innovation. So I want to take you back to where I live. So in the Dutch context. So if you take it on a purely science advances, one genius at a time they sit there, they think hard, and then they come up with ideas. It's a remarkable coincidence that when we go back to the 17th century, Christian Huygens, who found the rings around Saturn, and Antonin van Leeuwenhoek, who was the first to study microbial life in water, they lived within this is like a 20-minute cycle between each other, and my house is banging between the two there. And it'll be a remarkable coincidence if it's just a matter of kind of geniuses that these two guys who obviously used the same hairdresser and knew each other and corresponded, they were acquaintances of each other, came up with these two advances in two very disparate fields. And obviously, there isn't. It's the advance is actually driven by the infrastructure that they have access to, right? And the underlying infrastructure is a glass market. So they shared a glass market that had very high refined lenses, and this allowed them to improve both the telescope and the microscope. And this is what is driving the scientific advance. So ostensibly, what I do in my day-to-day work is look for the glass market and understand how that is actually driving forward scientific progress in lots of different areas of social research. So this is my analogy to get us going. But you can actually kind of, in the European context, this concept of research infrastructures, the birth of it really happened with CERN. So there have been other large-scale research infrastructures, and now there's lots of different ones in lots of different ways. But the mother of them all was the LHC. And I think this is a really interesting kind of example that has also been quite inspiring for myself, because I really like the story of the Higgs boson. So if you go back to Peter Higgs was just, and if in his own words, a pretty standard and ordinary postdoc who was just having a beer one day, had a thought, jotted it down in a paper, and then 5 billion euros later and 50 years, you have the actual testing his hypothesis. So one way to think about the work that I do is trying to find all the Peter Higgses out there who have all these ideas, and really I'm making sure that the infrastructure is there in the long run to test those ideas and actually bring them into a kind of empirical reality. So this is the day-to-day kind of work that I'm focused on. And I think it really is if you look at in the European research infrastructure landscape in particular, pretty much the only research infrastructures that exist in Europe are surveys, right? Surveys are great. I'm a survey researcher myself. I spent a long time working on surveys in Europe, but they have limitations and they have constraints. And actually, there's much more that we can do with proper investment and organization as social scientists when we actually really think carefully about the research infrastructure that we have at our disposal. One way to reverse this question, and a good think piece for you all, if you were to be contacted by whether it's the European Commission or the White House, and they said, hey, we've just found 5 billion euros, and we think social science would be a good way to spend this, what would we do, right? And I'm pretty sure that social science would go, I don't know, we should extend the PSID for indefinitely with a larger sample. That'd be great, right? I think we would be caught short and we wouldn't necessarily be too creative in our thinking. That's not to say I think 5 billion euros should be invested in the social sciences, but if we were asked the question, I don't think we would have the answer necessarily. And I think this feeds into a broader understanding of how we think of scientific progress. And especially in the European context, though, I suspect is similar here. We see way more investment going into what the kind of excellent science framework, finding the next genius and giving them a lot of resources so they can do what they want, rather than investing in infrastructure, which actually supports a common good and actually can make structural change to the scientific questions that we're answering. When we talk about social research in particular, I think in terms of, we've seen the impact of research infrastructure historically on sociology, like since its inception. And actually the inception of sociology comes from a massive change in the data infrastructure that was available. So going back to the late 19th century, so much of modern sociology was founded in those early surveys. So this is from the Booth map of London and poverty. But there are thousands of other examples around this time. So the Gua in the States, but also Rowntree in the UK, et cetera, that really drove forward the early kind of development of sociology as a field. And I would say since then, through the 20th century, it was predominantly driven forward by and dictated what was important by large-scale investments in things like survey infrastructures, who were basically saying what was important and what wasn't, and dictating research agendas. And we're moving to a period now with some of the technological and methodological advances where this is actually undergoing radical change. And it's changing the kinds of methods that we use and the kind of approaches that we can take. And so I'm interested principally in understanding those changes and how they're impacting the research agendas of postdocs and PhDs like yourself. So maybe this is a bit of background, but you're going to be curious as to why the Netherlands, right? So why should I care about the Dutch? So I'm not Dutch. Are there any Dutch people in the room? Just okay, I can make jokes about the Dutch. Great. This is good. Yay. So I'm not Dutch, but I've lived in the Netherlands for quite some time now. It is a peculiar country. So it isn't necessarily, the first thing I should say, it is not generalizable to the rest of the world. But its peculiarities actually do some things to the research infrastructure that make it a really nice place to work. And I actually probably one of the few people in the world that chose the country to live in based on the data infrastructure that was available. And it was quite hard to sell this to my wife, I can tell you that. So basically, that's why I live in the Netherlands, right? And so maybe you're asking, what do I mean by that? So the first thing that the Netherlands is different from most of the countries is it's pretty much man-made, right, as a country. So you may know that the Netherlands is principally under sea level, and the way you keep it from being under sea is by draining it. So historically, there has always been a large existential environmental threat, which means that there has always been a large amount of pooling of resources and data to manage that threat. And that threat is pretty even across the population. So when the floods come in, it doesn't really necessarily differentiate between the poor and the rich. So it's a great equalizer. So this means the Dutch are generally open to the concept of pooling risk and sharing data. So this sets a nice fertile ground, ironically, for creating a research infrastructure. The other thing that I would say historically that happened in the Netherlands that made it a very fertile ground for research infrastructure now, and pretty unique. So I call it the Goldilocks country because it's not too big, not too small. And in the early 19th century, Napoleon invaded and he put his brother in charge of the Netherlands. And one of the things that he did was create a civic register. So a population register, effectively, of the country, which was very useful. And then when Napoleon left, they got rid of Belgium from this alliance, basically. So there was Belgian independence, which is really interesting because if Belgium and the Netherlands had been together today, that would be a population around 30 million people. And I would have a very good guess that that would be a federated state because it would be a very diverse and heterogeneous Catholic South, Protestant North. And it would be basically much more decentralized than it is now. However, what we end up with because of Belgian independence is a population of 17 million people. And I would argue that this is basically as big a country you can have with a population register of this sort. And it is the biggest country in the world with this kind of population register. So Scandinavian countries are good. They're about 10 million at most. The Netherlands has 17 million people. And from a data perspective, it's always nice to have a larger population to work with, right? So basically, this kind of creates this fertile ground. What this means as well is you have a population register, just like you have in Sweden. But because over the preceding 150 years, one of the things that many Scandinavian countries had was they had great admin data, and surveys are expensive. So they didn't do too many surveys. Whereas in the Netherlands, they said, oh, we do have admin data, but we are quite large, so we still run the surveys. So you get this Goldilocks effect of having admin data and the surveys. Whereas in the UK and the US, there was much more reliance on the surveys. And this has had an effect now. And it means it's basically the only country where we can do what I'm about to show. So what I'm going to take you through now is Odyssey, the national infrastructure of which I am the director, and how it's structured. So I'm going to go through this quite fast because it's quite a lot to cover. So please do forgive me if I skimp on the details. There are QR codes if you want to know about specific stuff, and I'll make sure that the slides are shared. Plus, there's all the information you could want on the website. But basically, so what is Odyssey? What is the Dutch National Infrastructure for Social Science? We are a federated infrastructure, and what I mean by this perfect size of country. So there are only 14 research universities in the Netherlands, right? So I only ever have to talk to 14 different people. And we can get every university in the country to sign up and pay into this infrastructure, which makes it just about manageable. And basically, so every university in the country pays in. So it's not direct from the government, it's from the university itself, which is crucial because then we are accountable to the researchers and not to the funding agency. And they give us an ongoing operational budget. We also add within this all the public research agencies in the Netherlands as well, because they also conduct research and they have infrastructure requirements as well. And this gives us an operational budget to provide infrastructure. And what we do with that is then, through a governance structure, we distribute that across a federated infrastructure of services. And I'm going to take you through now some of the services that we provide. So it's a very simple governance structure that we do this through. So the first thing is the vanilla stuff that you might be quite familiar with is data collection. So we finance the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, in the Netherlands, the European Social Survey in the Netherlands. Every time there's a Dutch election, I have to find 175,000 euros to run the Dutch election study. And for those who are following Dutch politics, the cabinet is about full, so I'm terrified. So basically, this is the kind of stuff we finance. And we have a kind of range of surveys that we provide the ongoing structural financing for. So this is a basic function that we provide. Crucially, within the Netherlands, and this is different from quite a lot of other countries, all these surveys are sampled from the population register. And in most cases, we ask for consent to link it back as well. Okay, this is where it's going to start getting interesting in a bit. So one of the main people that we work with is the CBS, which is the statistical office in the Netherlands. They are the primary broker for the population register and all the bits around it. So this includes not just the population register itself of who lives there, but every single income tax record over the last 20 years, all the educational records, health insurance records. So if you were prescribed antidepressants, we can get a linkage to that. We can get your driving record. We can get your migration record. We can get all these different kinds of things. These are interlinkable within this brokerage system. And what we do is we work with CBS to make sure that the secure environment, this is accessible via a secure virtual environment online. And we make sure that this is actually functional and working for researchers. So for those of you who have worked with secure data before, oh, it's horrible, right? Because they give you a Windows 95 machine, it's clunky to work with, and they ask you to jump through all kinds of hoops. So we work with the statistical office to improve this, to improve the usability, to make sure it actually works for research purposes. It is not cheap to do this, and research projects in there are quite expensive. So the average cost of a research project using this linked data is about 7,500 euros, and that's for a kind of relatively modest project, and that can exponentially grow as project complexity grows. But the idea is you can take those surveys that I was talking about, link it to the administrative data, and analyze it in these environments. Now, the magic thing in the Netherlands that we have that is really great is the list panel. And this slide is going to start mucking up in a minute. Is the list panel. So the list panel is another survey, but it's slightly different from all the other surveys. So the list panel is an online probability panel, so which many different places have. You've got quite a few in the US. But the really magic thing about the list panel is, again, it's linkable to the administrative data. So everyone in the list panel is asked whether they consent for linkage to the administrative data, and about 85 to 90% agree to this. And so you can ask questions in the survey and then link it onto the administrative data. So anyone that's worked with administrative data or survey data knows that they're very much complementary and not necessarily substitutes. And so in this kind of situation, you get the best of both worlds, being able to use both in conjunction with each other. Okay, and what we do is we give grants to early career researchers to make this free access, but you can just walk up and pay for time in this panel. All the data collected in this panel, so it runs once a month. All the data collected in this is completely freely available and can be downloaded from the website. And there's no charge to that. Yeah. So I mentioned before that the environments that we have really suck in terms of the secure environments. And actually what it was doing is really constraining how people approach questions with this administrative data. Because basically what they would do is they would walk into the environment and they would make it look like survey data. And the reason that they would make it look like survey data isn't necessarily because they really love survey data. It was because computationally, they knew that that's what it could cope with. Because survey data is also computationally really efficient, right? It's very, very efficient to run the kinds of regressions and things like that. Very, very straightforward computationally. What we did was we actually made the secure environment of Statistics Netherlands linkable to the Dutch national supercomputer that allowed us to then move that data into a high performance computing environment. Now, this drastically changed the compute capacity that we had available to, and this drastically changed the types of research questions that we could answer. So the population network that Matt mentioned before, there is no new data in that. That data was sitting there for 20 years, and it's also the same in Denmark, it's the same in Sweden, it's the same in Finland. The only reason that someone didn't do this before, and this goes back to my beginning, was it because no one had the idea? No, it was simply because the memory wasn't sufficient to hold all that in memory in the environment, right? It was just, compute-wise, you just couldn't do it. So what we did, we took the handbrake off, we moved it into the supercomputing environment, and all of a sudden you can do this. And this is just as secure and recognized by the statistics office as being as secure. And sorry. So basically, this has actually drastically changed the types of questions we can ask. And I'm going to come to a few examples in a minute. What we also did provide is more generic environments for secure data. So not everything goes through the statistical office. So we have other kinds of data that we put through other more generic environments. And we also have a metadata catalog where you can browse through all the different data available. There are over 4,000 data points on every individual in the Netherlands that is cataloged in this portal. At the moment, it does require a little bit of Dutch, but we are going to fix that soon because, yeah, that's an impediment. So just to give a broad kind of idea of the scale of the operation that we have. So it's over 8,000 variables that we have in this portal. We have, a larger number of publications that have been generated in recent years. So it's a very active research community. But I think that the key question that I want to move on to for the rest of my talk is the different kind of changes in research that we've seen in recent years due to the new infrastructure. So Matt's already kind of mentioned one of the first one, which I think is really crucial. So when we created this secure supercomputing environment, one of the first people that actually approached us was Statistics Netherlands themselves, because they work with the administrative data more than anyone. And they said, what we would like to do with this, because we know our computers suck, is we would like to create a population scale network of the Netherlands. Now, what does this mean? A population scale network of the Netherlands is where we take every single person in the country and we use the administrative records to link them to all their colleagues, all their neighbors, all their classmates, all their family members, and we present that in one single graph. Now, when I say all family members, for example, this actually produces a family tree of the country. And actually, so 87% of the population is in one single component. So you can actually, if you take two people at random, there's a very high chance that you can actually figure out the distance between them in kind of like kinship matrix structure. So this is a very rich form of data, and it really kind of changes the types of questions that we can look at. Now, there's a project that has been working with this data now for a few years called PopNet, which has been validating the data, understanding its structure, looking at a lot of the actual graph theory questions in and around it and how it forms as a kind of multi-layer graph. So QR code if you want to dig more into that. But what I should also say is what's been very interesting in looking at this data is also how it relates to the survey infrastructure that we have. And one crucial question we were really curious about was when you look at the list panel, so what is the distance based on this graph between the 8 to 10,000 people that we have in the list panel, what is the average distance? And so on the side here, you can see this is the average path length between the respondents in the list panel. And one of the reasons I was particularly curious about this, so you can see that the average, I don't know if you can see at the back, the average distance is about 4.5 between respondents in the list panel. So we know, unsurprisingly, with a random sample, it's very diffuse. But this raises loads of interesting questions because when you have a population scale network, you really opens up the possibilities of looking at things like diffusion and a whole other kind of type of network processes that previously been really, really difficult to analyze. So we've been very interested in unpicking this. We're also interested in looking at things like exposure, so exposure to different groups and the degree to which there's polarization within elements of society. And Statistics Netherlands has got a bit carried away with this and has been producing lots of reports looking at social inequalities in the Netherlands. If you ask me, they're slightly overreading what's in the data so far, but it's causing a lot of societal debate. I think that as we move forward with this graph as well, we're looking at ways to change it, enrich it, and develop it further. So currently, there are just 5 types of relationships in the data. But if I go back to that metadata portal that I mentioned before, there are about 300 to 400 types of relationships that we can actually connect people together. So for example, in the Dutch care system, we can actually tie people to, you name your carer. So you say, this is my carer, so give them the care allowance, which creates a link between 2 people in the data. And therefore, we can actually represent that in the graph. And there's lots of different relationships in Dutch society that we can actually represent in this way. And so, yeah, there's lots of different kinds of elaborations on this network. The other thing that I should say is since the publication of this paper, this is now a dynamic graph and it extends over about 12 years. So you can actually see how these relationships form. People get married or people get divorced or people go to change jobs and how their network structure changes, and it can change quite dramatically. So this has been something that's been very, it's gone off in all different kinds of tangents within the Odyssey research community. The thing though, I don't reveal, this is spoilers, sorry, everybody look away. So just to go back, one of the things the obvious limitation of this is these are administrative relationships. So we don't know if you're really friends. We don't even know, they might be your colleague, but you may never meet, right? You may just, so we don't know, right? And that's frustrating. So this might be useful in some senses, but it's got obvious limitations relative to survey data. So one of the ideas is we can survey to validate some of these ties, but then also something happened in 2020 that you might have heard about, which really helped us validate this network, right? And understand whether people were actually in contact with each other, which is the COVID hit. And I mentioned before, this is going to get annoying. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so I will just talk over that and then I'll ping back in a minute. So what happened with COVID, I mentioned before, we link a lot of different types of data together in the statistical environment at CBS. One of those things is COVID test data and COVID vaccination data. So during the early days of the pandemic, if you allow yourself to go back in time to that, there was systematic testing. And this systematic testing generated a huge amount of data that could be linked onto the individual level. And it's jumping ahead too much now. I don't know why this is on autoplay. But basically, so it was generating a huge amount of data, and we can link this to the network and actually see the co-risk of infection. So if this person is infected, what is the likelihood that this person is infected in the next 3 days, which basically lights our graph up like a Christmas tree. And it kind of tells us, if you can see on the left here, that the different types of relationships. So you, as you would expect, family relationships show a lot of co-infection, colleagues much less, and actually that's very differentiated by different types of industry and also different types of educational institutions as well as this. This really helped us get a good sense of what was working in the data and what wasn't, and we can then subsequently adapt the graph to better kind of capture relationships that are actually happening on the ground. So then what happened, moving forward, actually, we wanted to link this to the broader survey infrastructure, because once we have the vaccine data and the infection data, there's a lot of research being done with the impact of COVID on the social interactions. And there are a lot of agent-based models and simulations looking at how people actually reacted to the risk of infection. So we had groups in the Netherlands that were doing this on an agent-based model perspective. But as we all know, when you run these kind of experiments, it's very, very limited. And there's so many assumptions that are built into them. What we wanted to do was we ran one of these games. We actually ran it in the list panel. And so what we were able to do was using this, rather than saying, okay, saying to people, you can break off ties within this kind of relationships when infections appear in your network, we could actually structure these communities in our experiment based on whether their vaccination record and their COVID test record. So basically the extent to which they had exhibited an actual risk behavior in the past. And this allowed us to kind of validate these simulations in much more detail than is normally the case with these kind of large-scale agent-based model simulations or mass online games, where you tend to be using a very non-probability-based sample and that is of questionable quality. So as you can see here in this kind of simulation, what we were able to validate is this kind of behavior where we see people, a network of individuals with ties, and they gain benefits from maintaining those ties, but then penalization for having exposure to infections, and seeing how they adapt, break off ties, and then reform them as infections break in their network. And we were able to structure this based on the perceived risk behavior in the population. Okay. So this is one application in the context of COVID we've seen with this kind of integrated data infrastructure. So going backwards and forwards between administrative and survey data infrastructure, to get the best of both worlds, basically. And now I'm going to go forward. Now, I'm a bit set. You might be wondering why Matt made me sound very altruistic before, but I must admit I'm very selfish. So basically, this is also to support my own research. So I'm a user of the infrastructure as well. So a project that I'm trying to implementing at the moment as part of my ERC project that uses a similar approach really looks at the contagion of childcare behavior. Now, childcare behavior is a really interesting one because for those of you who don't know, childcare usage has been increasing massively over the last 2 decades. And this is pretty much in every country. But it's a little bit unclear exactly why. There are a lot of policy interventions that are supporting it, but the actual progress of kind of diffusion of this practice is a little bit unknown. So one of the primary kind of suspects of this drive is basically increasing institutional trust and kind of cultural change towards basically a dual learner household and kind of greater trust in institutional childcare facilities. Now, what this kind of indicates towards is what we would call like a complex contagion perspective, because childcare being a very complex behavior. So for those who have young children in the room, this might ring a little bit true. So when you have a young kid, you've got to try and combine the intensive childcare needs with the needs of your partner, your family members around you, so the extent to which you can draw on those, but also they've got to fit with your work arrangements and your childcare arrangements. It's a difficult puzzle to solve. And so when we are faced with these kind of complex problems, we learn from people around us. So there's a diffusion process. So basically the idea goes that the more you actually observe this in your local network, the more likely you are to adopt this kind of intensive usage of formal childcare or particular usage patterns of formal childcare. Now, the problem is this is really difficult to test because when you do a survey, you don't really know much about the people in the network. And anyone here who's had that great idea, wouldn't it be great if I did a network survey and then you do it and it's horrible and it's like, it's the compound non-response and all these kind of things make it very difficult to collect really high quality data. So in my project, what I wanted to kind of do is really understand these complex contagion processes. Now, one way I can do this is purely with the administrative record, right? So I can look at the childcare usage of one person, and I can see the childcare usage of their neighbors, of their family members, all this kind of stuff, which is great. But there's a huge amount of endogeneity within all of this, and the causal processes are exceptionally complex and difficult to unpick. One thing that I wanted to do to kind of short circuit that a little bit is, wouldn't it be great if I could do a survey of those people and have a network survey to understand the transmission of these attitudes and values? But how would you actually go about doing that? So what I'm doing in this project is using the population scale network, not as an analytical framework, but as a survey sampling framework. So in this, what we're doing is we're designing a sample and that will actually, in the end, produce a net sample of about 1,875 new mums, so who've had a child in the last year. Because in the Netherlands, a great thing about the sampling frame is you can literally go, CBS, just find anyone that's just had a baby and send them a survey, please. And they'll do it, which is great. But we can also take the population scale network, break it down using very kind of standard algorithmic techniques in computer science into different communities. So we're not talking about geospatial communities per se. These are network communities. So where it actually says, oh, these people work and their family together, they're much more likely to be linked than other people. And you can break the country down into however many chunks you want. So for example, you can, and we can actually see its effect on the average path length, and it decreases as you make the community smaller. Because many of these algorithms are designed to make path length smaller, I should add. So if you start with a community of 1, obviously that's the country size, and that's the country size, so it's a little bit above 4.5. If we break it into province, so there's 12 provinces in the Netherlands, it starts to fall a little bit. Gemeente, which is municipality, so there's 350 of those things in the Netherlands. It starts to really drop. Like there's the path lengths between people here. It really starts to drop. Wijken is a couple of city blocks, I guess, and then Bert is like 1, right? So it really starts to decrease quite dramatically. And once we get down to about here, we can actually do kind of cluster samples, and what you end up with is a bunch of egos. And on average, they have exposure to about 50 people in the sample of a path length or 2 or less. Okay, so you have this very clustered sampling. And this actually allows us then, resulting kind of data that we have out of this, to use a very kind of the whole suite of network tools and things like this to work with a national level representative sample of actual networks. And we can study all the different network dynamics within that. Okay. But I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go through a few other different examples of research that the infrastructure is supporting. So one, I don't know if anyone, I think we pay more attention to US politics than you pay to Dutch politics. But last November, we had a really fun one. We had our Trump moment in the Netherlands. So basically, the far right won the election in the Netherlands last year after a massive last minute, very terrifying surge in the polls. And actually, this was attributed a lot to online behavior. I mentioned before that every time they do these elections, I've got to raise the money. One advantage of this, though, is that we can actually use this as part of an integrated infrastructure. So one tool that we have within the list panel that we've developed is a data donation platform. So we don't just ask survey questions. You can donate particular types of data. Anyone familiar with the general data protection regulation in the EU? Most people are a bit down on it, but it has this really nice thing, and it says that companies have to provide all their data on you in a machine readable format. And this means that we can ask people, hey, get your WhatsApp data, put it into this little box. We'll strip out all the personal identifying information on your device, and then you can upload it to our server, right? And we give them the little algorithm that strips out the necessary information. And that means we can have pseudonymized, fine-grained data donation data linked to this panel, right? And we did this with TikTok and YouTube data from during the election. So we were able to see people's viewing behavior from these platforms during the election and link this to the actual national election study. Analysis is still ongoing, but just for reference, actually, we got into a bit of a lawsuit with TikTok because the data they provided was not so machine readable. So there's always a fun bit of legislation involved with legal action involved in this kind of work. So this is one example of this kind of integrated infrastructure approach. And again, as you can probably tell, because this is a common theme, all that data as well is then onwardly linkable to the administrative data records as well. So you can, in theory, look at people's network position and stuff. Then we also have research. So the part of our kind of consortium is the Netherlands Twin Register, which is a study of not all, but most twins in the Netherlands, and it collects systematic data on kind of biomedical measures, including gene data, that is then linkable to the administrative data via a secure trusted third-party agreement. And this has helped us do lots of research on gene-environment interactions and its effect on long-term educational outcomes. And we also, via our secure analytical environment, we're also analyzing corporate data. So we have the register of all companies in the Netherlands, which is not anonymized. So it's a public register. And so we have the names of all the directors and all the company names. So we're doing lots of annotation work on this kind of corporate data, and also links between individual corporate entities. So lots of different research being generated from the infrastructure. Okay, so but one line of research which I think is a big future direction of travel is actually something that didn't even start, I don't think, in the Netherlands, and I want to give some credit to the Danish. I reluctantly kind of give some credit to some Scandinavians. So this paper came out just over a year ago. It feels like a lot longer ago, to be honest. And this is basically taking the administrative data and looking at this much more complex structure and treating it almost as kind of sequences of text, and using these to see if we can predict life events. And this really, so what I would say is I put up an image of Sputnik here, because I would refer this as the Sputnik paper, because the idea is groundbreaking. The execution is, it's a little bit, bolting things together and getting it done. So in terms of, they only looked at 2 outcomes, for example, really, which is to look at the death and people's personality traits, which is quite a choice. They're in the kind of things you're going to look at. But in theory, it can be generalized to a large number of different outcomes. And it also uses quite a limited range of data. And particularly, it's solely reliant on administrative data. But it does open up really new, interesting questions about what we're actually looking for in infrastructure going forward. Because this kind of approach is only possible when you provide administrative data with higher performance computational environments. The way they achieved this paper was the researchers bought a GPU, walked into the statistical office and plugged it in, right? There was no kind of provision by the statistical office. They literally gave them it and said, please just plug it in. Your computers are terrible, right? That's basically what happened. And so what we want to do is scale that up. So not everyone has to walk up and plug in a GPU at their statistical office to make this work. So we're really looking to scale this up. And one other issue is with this kind of approach is it opens up new questions about how we can work cross-nationally with administrative data linkage. So one interesting question, they've developed this model in the context of Denmark, is the extent to which it's actually applicable in the context of the Netherlands, and actually the extent to which these results are actually generalizable. However, this is very, very difficult to do with the security constraints, quite rightly so. But there is a lot of kind of learning to be done between these different groups in different countries. The other thing that I would say is this approach that they implemented in this paper does not take account in any way that the different records of individuals are actually related to each other. So this is not based on a graph approach that I've been talking about here. So the dependency of sequence is not accounted for. And they actually already showed incremental improvements over like standard benchmarks from the field. The other thing is that the plugging in of one GPU did help in this instance to get it done, but one GPU can only go so far. And actually, the computational constraints in this field are considerable. And actually, it really does make a difference when you have greater computational resources for these types of applications. But what this means is the infrastructure requirements, so all those different questions that I set out the presentation with, these are changing quite dramatically as we look forward about the different types of research questions that could be answered in the next few years. So we are going to have to pivot quite hard in the coming years as to what these new infrastructure would look like. So I just want to conclude with a few different AI approaches that we're working on in the Dutch context that build on this. So one is using these kind of the network and the rich administrative data to create synthetic data files. Now, there are a number of different strategies to produce these kinds of synthetic data, but how this interacts with the legal framework and the technical framework to actually export it and make it broadly available, it's a very, very complex question. And so we're working on that with Statistics Netherlands. We're also, as Matt, and the reason that Varun isn't here is the preferred data challenge. So actually doing this in a large scale, so having many teams work on a single challenge to identify, okay, which approach is actually proving effective, and maybe we can recombine these approaches, very much inspired by Matt's work on fragile families. So we're also running this project, and we have plans for future ones as well. We're also trying to understand how we can make this data much more usable and onwardly usable by the research community. So the large-scale network data, you shouldn't have to open this data and create your own embeddings from this and understand what they mean. So we have a project called Net Audit within Odyssey, which is looking at these network embeddings and ones that have great onward utility and actually measure something that's substantively interesting, and how you document this and communicate this to the wider research community. We also trying to use the really rich data to understand better the metadata that describes this, because there are reams and reams of metadata. So administrative data, we tend to think it is very simple, but it's actually exceptionally complex. And what we think it means isn't exactly what it's actually capturing. So just to say, like, for example, the tax return, so your tax return appears almost as is in the administrative data environment. And as I'm sure in the US, it's quite difficult to navigate through the tax return and understand the definitions. Yeah, so now try being the user of that data at the other end. It's a very complex process to really understand what is being measured in every instance. So we're using models to try and annotate and enrich these column headings. And as I mentioned before, the generalized life course prediction task, so not just working on fertility, but also a far wider range of behaviors to see whether the performance is equally good or equally bad in those kind of areas. And then I'm also working on a few different projects using dynamic graph neural networks for not just care type formations, but also other different types of tie formations, such as marriage, for example. So whether we can actually predict which two nodes within the network will actually marry each other. So lots of different research projects going on at the moment in Odyssey. But to add as a bit of a conclusion, this is a really big change in a lot of different research that's going on within Europe. And it's requiring a very heavy pivot in the research infrastructure strategy within Europe away from, and I've got nothing against surveys. Surveys are great and we should keep doing them. But there is other stuff that we can be doing and should be doing. And I think if we don't do it, it's going to drastically limit what we can do in social research going forward. And crucially, the question that I always get right after I finish presenting is, hang on a minute, what about the ethics? What about the legislation around it? Which is a major question, which is exactly why we need further work done on this. So in the Netherlands, we have a particular legal and ethical framework, but this isn't necessarily generalizable to everywhere else. And there are many questions about what can be and can't be done with this data. One of the things I mentioned about in the COVID context, the Dutch government was so keen for us to tell them that this network was going to solve all their problems. And we were just like, no, it's just definitely not. This can't be moved into production yet. And we need to set out the clear criteria of when it can and how it should be done. And that is a huge amount of work that we've got ahead of us. So that's basically the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.